passionate academic, a writer, a passionate speaker, and of course an advocate for human rights. So no other than Professor Stephen Marks from the Harvard Chan School of Public Health, fellow Harvard faculty. Please, the floor is yours, and you feel free to be able to use up the time as the final and the keynote speaker of this morning's session. Thank you very much.
Well, good morning, everybody. Being the last speaker, of course, is a dangerous task because some of you might be anxious to leave, or some of you might be expecting a resounding conclusion to the whole event. But I do want to begin by thanking the European Network for Smoking and Tobacco Prevention and the Romanian organization for inviting me here and giving me an opportunity to share with you some thoughts on a topic that has preoccupied me for the last 15 years. I also want to express my appreciation to ASH, Action on Smoking and Health, that has involved me in their activities over the years. My purpose today will be, in a sense, having heard the brilliant presentations of a moment ago, to challenge you, those of you who are not part of the network of people who have already been convinced that human rights can be an accelerator for tobacco control. That's in the title of my talk, an accelerator for tobacco control. To reflect for a moment, in light of the previous presentations, on what is the real potential for that accelerator to function. What is the real potential for human rights to be a critical element in the global strategy for 2025 on all three strategic goals of accelerating action, building partnerships, and protecting integrity. Now, that's not self-evident. You need to look critically at the issues. We also have a second challenge. And in mentioning the second challenge, I'm looking at my friend, Dr. Barakis, about the role of science. Obviously, public health initiatives, including tobacco control, are evidence-based and science-based. Introducing human rights, is that part of the same process? Or is that bringing in something else? Let's reflect on these issues. So, in order to reflect on them, I would like to challenge you to address with me the following questions. First of all, I'm assuming that many of you are encountering the linkages between human rights and tobacco control for the first time, and that you come from the tobacco control community deeply embedded within the public health community. And in the public health community, you might have encountered a suspicion of the human rights framework as being something that perhaps protects smokers' rights. Well, let's reflect on that for a minute. Secondly, isn't it true that tobacco control is dealt with in the public health sector where you have many tools? All the discussions previously were outlining the tools available for public health. What do we need another set of tools? And what are those tools? And do they, as the title of my presentation suggests, provide some form of accelerator to the process you're all deeply engaged in? Thirdly, this has been mentioned by several others, and I'll be quite brief on that. Well, what are the linkages between tobacco control and human rights? How do we in the human rights community say there's a fit here? And finally, what are the practical applications? And there's going to be a workshop on this later this week for those of you who want to examine it in greater depth. So let's look at the first question. Well, I was surprised to discover when I joined the public health community 20 years ago from my previous incarnation in a law school and a school of, at Columbia University and the school of ENSP, that in the public health community, there was a suspicion. You human rights folks, you're talking about individual rights. And the gun community claim a right to own guns. The tobacco control community claims a human right to tobacco control. Well, how ridiculous is this? is an organization, World Smokers Day, that organizes an event around a human rights theme, smokers' rights. Although the United Nations no longer seems to believe in or abide by their own Declaration of Human Rights, smokers are here to remind them that at least one segment of global society takes their articles seriously. And they even borrow from the language of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that says we must rise up against tyranny and oppression. So utilizing that human rights language, people in the smokers' rights community are using the UN human rights framework to rise up against tyranny and oppression. Here's another smokers' rights issue. It is essential for smokers to rebel against tyranny and oppression, as I was saying. And this is an organization that exists for that purpose, to take up the sword of justice. All right. We can laugh at this, but it is nevertheless true, as the quotation from a bioethicist in an earlier slide represents, that there is a certain suspicion. Is human rights defending the rights of individuals to, for example, consume a legal product? After all, that's what it's all about. Well, here, from the human rights perspective, let me suggest to you a critical conceptual clarification. In law, a right is any legally protected interest. So the right of a landlord to evict the family in the middle of winter because they haven't paid their rent is a right. It's got nothing to do with human rights. If a country does not ban the sale of cigarettes, purchasing cigarettes is a right. It's got nothing to do with human rights. So what are human rights? What is the difference? And I think this is important for those of you who are new to the human rights framework. Human rights are those rights that have been determined by a given society, national or international, to define the core values of that society, and have been integrated at the highest level of the legal system and of the mindset of the population to deserve protection against all other rights, all ordinary rights. Now, that understanding of human rights means that constitutionally protected rights at the national level and internationally agreed upon human rights that derive from the vast framework of legal treaties and processes emerging from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights define what those rights are. There is no right to consume a product that kills 50% of the people who consume it as directed. That is not a human right. The right to the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health is a human right. The right to life is a human right. The right to clean water is a human right. The right to a clean environment is a human right. Now, those rights confront directly the framework of the tobacco industry. So that's my first point. My second point is, okay, tobacco consumption is a public health issue. The Framework Convention on Tobacco Control is adopted where? Not in the United Nations, in the Human Rights Council. It is adopted by the members of the World Health Organization, whose background and training is to utilize their medical and public health knowledge to advance the health of people all over the world. We've got plenty of tools in that regard. We've got plenty of tools in the World Health Organization and in ministries of health. Who needs you people? In fact, and that's where I'm turning to the question of science. The public health approach to solving problems begins with science, through data collection, identifying through a scientific basis what is the issue at hand, using surveillance techniques and data collection, and identifying risks and protective factors. That's where research and the science comes in. And once we've done that, from that knowledge, we develop interventions and then evaluate those interventions. And we determine what works, and then we scale up. So where does human rights come into that? Well, not at all. Human rights is a different modality of social action to improve human well-being. This is designed to improve human well-being. Human rights also is designed to improve human well-being, but it uses a different technique. So the real question before us today, if we're looking at the title of my presentation about an accelerator to achieve development and human rights objectives, where does tobacco control fit as an accelerator? We need to understand that the public health framework, this one, can be mutually reinforcing with a different framework. A framework that does not start by saying, give us the evidence, the scientific evidence, we want to see the data, do the regressions, let's find what the data show, and then we'll design interventions. The human rights perspective is to say there are problems around the world, and we are concerned enough about them to want to clarify the normative framework. And in clarifying that normative framework, we utilize what we call authoritative decision-making. At the national level, that's the constitution process that leads to a Bill of Rights and a constitution. At the international level, that's the process of drafting norms through declarations and conventions and additional protocols to conventions. So the issue here is to mobilize the community to clarify what is expected to realize a right by going from the process of studying the problem, and typically you ask a human rights person to study the problem, they're going to conclude by saying, oh, well, there's inadequate protection of this right, let's elaborate a new norm. Well, that's what happened since 1948, is that 9 core conventions of the United Nations and regional treaties, of course the Council of Europe being the first one to translate the Universal Declaration of Human Rights into a binding human rights treaty with a protection mechanism with the Commission and Court, and now the Court of Human Rights. That translates that normative framework into a norm enforcing process. The procedures that ensure that the rights are protected, promoted, and fulfilled. So this is essentially what human rights people do. And the public health framework is essentially what public health people do. The question then is, given these premises on which we operate, how do we cooperate in a way that enhances the realization of one of the human rights that is recognized from the human rights perspective through our norm enforcement process, which is not always accusatory, it's also cooperative, working with governments to help them do a better job because they have agreed by signing on to human rights treaties that they want to do a better job. That process is perfectly compatible, in my view, at least at the argument that I've made, and I will fail utterly if I don't convince you by the end of this talk, that that process is one that is perfectly consistent with implementation processes for the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control and other mechanisms designed by the global health system. Now, if that is potentially true, that those two frameworks can work together, how has that linkage been expressed in critical documents? Well, we all know that the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control cites the principal relevant human rights text. This is the hook. This message of this language in the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control is a message to all of those working in this field to say, hang on, there have been developments prior to this adoption of this convention, Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, that are directly relevant to what we are trying to do by adopting this convention on this Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. It is reflected in Article 12 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. It is reflected in the Constitution of the World Health Organization itself. It is reflected in the Convention on the Rights of the Child. So that was the hook at the time. The linkages have expanded exponentially since then. That's a pretty good starting point. A core international treaty, the Constitution of WHO itself with a human rights linkage and a definition of the right to that the highest attainable standard of health is one of the fundamental rights of every human being, and other conventions such as the Convention on the Rights of the Child. So what are these other conventions? Where has this linkage been, by implication, expanded from those references in the preamble to the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control? All right, as I said, it started with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The preamble to the Framework Convention mentions Article 12, and it mentions the Convention on the Rights of the Child. But there's also the right to health in the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, and the Convention on Racial Discrimination, and the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and virtually all of the major human rights treaties provide that hope, the same hope that we're talking about, to link tobacco control with human rights. The language of the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights affirms the right of everyone to enjoy the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. And then it has a second paragraph that enumerates examples of the sorts of things that we need to do in the health system to realize this right. The improvement of all aspects of environmental and industrial hygiene. And the committee that monitors the Human Rights Convention has gone to great pains to clarify the meaning of 12.2b, and has included discouraging the use of tobacco as an example of what we mean by improving all aspects of environmental and industrial hygiene. Awkward language when you're dealing with tobacco control, I agree. Very awkward language. We're in the early stages here. Where have we come since then? But I need to mention as well the various regional conventions that also contain the right to health. Each one of these is another hook to the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. The European Social Charter, the American Additional Protocol, the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, the Arab Charter, the Access Charter. Now, these linkages between the human rights framework and the goal of public health to eliminate tobacco and smoking has attracted the interest of scholars. And I mentioned this at the plenary the other day about the what got me involved in this. It was when I had, as a student in my course on health and human rights, a thoracic surgeon who came to me and said, "You've been talking about health and human rights. You haven't mentioned tobacco." I said, "Oh, well, that's a thing that, you know, public health people take care of. And it's important to do that. Please continue. But we have other things, other priorities in the human rights field." Yeah, there's a brief mention of it in that interpretive document of Article 12. But, you know, that's fairly minor. Let's deal with the big issues. He said, "No. I have opened up too many chests. I have seen what this does. This is really important." And there were tears in her eyes. And I said, "Okay, you're opening my eyes. Work on it. Write a paper." And she did. And we worked together and published this in 2006 in the Human Rights Quarterly, which is the leading publication in human rights. And that got us started to work with other colleagues who were in this room in creating the Human Rights and Tobacco Control Network to say, okay, we've reached this realization. We need to translate that into practice. What can we do? And that's what I'm going to come to in my conclusion. Of course, we're not alone. Many other scholars have addressed this issue of how do you conceptualize human rights to the challenge of tobacco control. A recent book that I had the pleasure to co-edit with some colleagues in Washington contains a chapter that Oscar Carrera and Larry Gostin authored on tobacco control. This is on realizing the right to health, Oxford University Press. And they developed a very important point to understand how, from the human rights perspective, we advance the tobacco control network. And the idea is it comes from that same general comment describing the normative content of the right to health beyond the half a page of the article in the text of the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. For 22 pages, the text elaborates on what are the specific normative content, and specifically on the obligation to respect, the obligation to protect, and the obligation to fulfill. That's what Article 12 is all about. All states that have ratified that have accepted these three types of obligations. And what that means is to refrain from actively promoting the use of tobacco control. If you don't do that, you are not complying with the obligation that you freely contracted to under Article 12 of the Covenant. To protect, to regulate the tobacco industry. And I would say, from the tobacco control point of view, to put it out of business. And the obligation to fulfill comprehensive tobacco control legislation. This is the document that I was talking about that contains the detailed framework, and this is the exact language of that authoritative interpretation of the contents of Article 12 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights that mentions that it embraces issues including discouraging the abuse of alcohol and of tobacco, drugs, and other harmful substances, explicitly represented there. And the duty to provide adequate and appropriate information on those issues, including tobacco control. And under the section on violations of the obligation to protect, the failure to discourage production, marketing, and consumption of tobacco and other harmful substances constitutes a violation of the right to health. Couldn't be clearer. All the parties to the human rights conventions that contain the right to health are subjected to this obligation. Now the question is, from the public health point of view, are we getting in the way by telling governments you have human rights obligations, and that kind of sends a signal to say, oh no, keep these people out of here. I want to work with WHO. I want to work with the Ministry of Health. These people are pointing an accusatory finger. The accusatory finger is only when there's been a blatant disregard for the obligation. The more important thing is the cooperative mode of action, and that's what I'm coming to now. So what are the practical ways in which you can utilize the human rights framework to be an accelerator, to contribute to the three strategic goals of the Global Strategy 2025? What concretely can we do to accelerate action under the Framework Convention, to build partnerships, and to protect integrity? Well, there are roughly 7 approaches to doing this. This gets technical. This gets into the weeds. And there's going to be a workshop that will give you an opportunity for those of you who are interested in it to look specifically at how we utilize international human rights procedures to nudge governments in the direction that they've already accepted under the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. So what is wrong with this mutually reinforcing framework? Obviously, we know that the tobacco control framework has not eliminated tobacco from our lives, has not eliminated smoking. We need to mobilize the resources, and in fact, I will take strategic objective number 2, building partnerships. What better partnership than those institutions that also work with governments and civil society to accomplish human rights objectives? These are the 7 approaches. The particular ones that I think the workshop will probably focus on is the treaty monitoring system, the special procedures, and the universal periodic review. So this is where we meet. Framework Convention meets up the hill in the World Health Organization. But my main point and my conclusion here is that for the first decades, let's say 4 or 5 decades, of efforts to make the realization of human rights an objective of the global community, and the realization of global health, including tobacco controls, an objective of the global community, have been not really siloed, but have been pursued by professionals who know what they're doing. And we've reached a stage, and I think the last 10 or 15 years has given us an opportunity to test the hypothesis that we have reached a stage where the human rights people who understand the mechanisms that governments pay attention to make progress on human rights, and the public health people that are using the Framework Convention on tobacco control to achieve the strategic objectives of for 2025, have now tested the waters of functioning together. And my appeal to you is that as you move forward in your own professional careers in dealing with tobacco control, that you consider that you also have partners in the human rights community to work together to eliminate smoking and tobacco. Thank you very much.